The heroic age of Antarctic exploration is the very earliest part of the 20th century. Roughly speaking, we're looking from the period of around about 1900 through to about 1920. During that time, there were loads and loads of different expeditions to go and explore the Antarctic continent. Not a lot of it was known. The North Pole had already been reached nearly 100 years prior to that. But down in the South Pole, no one had got on top of the Polar Plateau before, even though quite a lot of the coastline around it had been mapped. There had been various expeditions throughout the end of the 19th century to try and establish a firm map of the entire circumference of the continent. There had been landings from various different countries, from Japan to Germany to Great Britain, but the explorers wanted to probe deep into the continent, and someone wanted to be the very, very first to get to the South Pole. In 1901, there was a Royal Research Ship Discovery. In fact, you can see it behind me here on the quayside, and it's now home of Dundee. This ship was used by Captain Robert Falcon Scott. He went down predominantly on a scientific mission, but with one of his goals was to try and obtain the South Pole. This was a very, very new experience for a lot of British sailors and people. If you think back to early polar explorations, such as those undertaken by people like James Clark Ross and Franklin in the 1830s through to the 1850s, there had been a massive gap in technology and advancements between then and the beginning of the 20th century. So when Captain Scott went down, the conditions weren't fully known about and they were using brand new equipment. And for a lot of the British sailors that went down there and the rest of the research team, some of these things had never been tried or tested before. So the first expedition that Captain Scott went on wasn't a massive success, but what it did provide was a huge wealth of new scientific knowledge and also paved the way for further explorers to follow in his footsteps. There'd be lots and lots of supplies you had to take down. These sort of journeys would take place over 2 to 4 years in some cases, and you had to take everything with you. In those days, there would be absolutely no rescue from Antarctica whatsoever. In fact, it could be so bad, even later on. In the 1950s, for example, a Russian expedition went down, and in those days, before there was an airstrip or anything on the Antarctic continent, the only hope of rescue was by sea. One of the Russians on the expedition, sadly, his appendix burst, and of course, normally the surgeon would have to remove that. Unfortunately, the person whose appendix burst was the surgeon. So what he did, because there was no hope of rescue, and if he didn't get it out, it would probably kill him, he decided to anaesthetise around the area, put a mirror above the operating table, cut himself open, remove his own appendix, and then stitch himself back up. So even 70 years ago, it was still pretty deadly. But you've got to imagine that on a ship such as the Discovery, space is at a premium, and you've got to pack it all for maybe 4 years of research. Well, on the Discovery, they managed to find enough space to take about 70 stone in weight of tobacco, because all of them smoked. So clearly it was an essential thing for when they got down there, alongside skis and other supplies such as food and bits as well. The other people that were exploring at this time were people such as Ernest Shackleton, who went on the Discovery with Captain Scott, and in fact achieved one of the very, very furthest souths during that expedition. He went down several times, one in his Nimrod expedition in 1909, slightly later on in the ill-fated Endurance expedition when his ship got crushed in the ice in 1914, and later on with a mission known as the Quest expedition, although sadly he died in South Georgia before he actually got to the South Pole. So there's some of the British ones, and then of course there is a very famous man called Douglas Mawson. Douglas Mawson was in fact an Australian. His family were English, and he went down and mapped a lot of the coastline and claimed some areas for the Crown as well. But they were scientists, and they were more interested in scientific exploration rather than trying to gain the South Pole. So this is what your ship looks like. These are what some of your supplies looks like. But what would happen next? How would you actually travel from here to the South Pole? This is the deck of the Discovery, and as you can see, this is still the age of sail, but Discovery also had engines as well. This was very, very common with all of the different types of vessels that went down. Discovery was the Royal Research Ship Discovery, or the RRS. I'm wearing the SY Endurance, the steam yacht Endurance. There was also the SS Aurora, which was used by Douglas Mawson as well. So the idea was that you would have engines for quite a lot of the manoeuvring between the ice, and then you'd be sailing in order to preserve coal for the rest of the time. The different routes that they would take would normally be going across the Atlantic. In Ernie Shackleton's case, during the Endurance, they went down to Argentina and they left Buenos Aires and then headed across to South Georgia and then eventually down to their landing area, which was down in the Weddell Sea. Captain Scott and others ended up going, and along with Douglas Mawson as well, who obviously sailed directly from Australia, went down to Australia first and then approached the Antarctic from the other direction, heading for the Great Ice Barrier as it was known, or the Ross Ice Shelf as it is today. So, the people on board ship would have to be very, very good at sailing, climbing up the rigging that you can see behind me and going across the foot ropes on the spars, all right, and then releasing the sails to be able to make the most of the wind to propel them through the water. As I say, when they got down into the ice though, there would be ice flows and breaks in the ice, and they would have to try and manoeuvre as best they could using the engines. Of course, the more often that you did that, the less and less coal you would have, and then obviously it'd be harder and harder then to eventually either negotiate your way out of trouble or even make yourself able to get all the way back home. Life on board these ships was done in watches, so normally you had 4 hours on and up to 4 to 8 hours off, and you'd be rotating round. Once down in Antarctica, it could get bitterly, bitterly cold. Obviously, for those men that were marching across the Antarctic continent, frostbite was a real problem. But even on deck, just in these conditions, it would be absolutely icy cold. So, hopefully, when you were down below, you'd be able to keep nice and warm with one of the stoves. Keeping the stoves going throughout the night was one of the jobs of the watches, and of course that took up valuable coal as well. So, over the time when they first would land, they would still be living on board ship until they had built a hut and a base on land. And they'd be drawing down the coal for that to try and keep themselves warm, and obviously to cook as well. All of the ovens were coal-fired on board, and the chef had a really important job trying to keep everyone full with calories as best they could. When they went down, the food on board ship would just be sort of standard things like stews, soups, potatoes, that sort of thing. But once they were out marching across the Antarctic continent, their food wasn't quite so enjoyable. On board deck at the minute, you can see it's pretty clean and tidy. So this would be before everything was stowed on board. When they went down on the Discovery, for example, there would be dogs on board as well. They were housed in kennels on board ship, and they also took down some livestock as well. So all of that would be across the deck. There would be cases and things, wooden cases, strapped down as well. There would be very, very little room on board deck because every ounce of space was valuable to take down all the necessary supplies that would support them for that long in Antarctica. So, down on the ship, sail hopefully across some calm seas, stopping off at various points to get more fuel, etc. And then it's a case of getting there and building somewhere to live. Once you reached Antarctica and you found a suitable landing spot, what you'd have to do then is remove everything from the ship and take it to the place where you build your base camp. This would hopefully be on relatively firm land, and it could be several miles from the edge of the coast, so you'd have to haul all of your supplies in. Man hauling, which we'll talk about a little bit later on, was done on sledges similar to this one, and you'd be dragging all of your equipment inland and you'd be relaying this in various different ways. Sometimes, as I say, man hauling was the way. Captain Scott had several motorised sledges, and there would be ponies and dogs that would be able to pull some of the heavy burden as well. Dogs were used by nearly all of the expeditions during the heroic age of Antarctic exploration. The Norwegian Amundsen, who beat Captain Scott to the South Pole in 1911, he took dogs and used them to great effect and beat Captain Scott there by well over a month. Once you got down there, it was a case of sorting out all the supplies into different areas. So, for example, the hut that you can see behind me is Captain Scott's hut built at McMurdo Sound. This is basically a giant IKEA, okay? It's completely flat pack, and then you would have to build it once you got down there. All the parts were numbered and labelled. This wasn't anything new. Hospitals had been numbered and labelled and shipped out in flat pack form in the 1850s during the Crimean War. So, once that was built, you hopefully had somewhere relatively warm to bunk, but you can see it at the minute without much around it. What would happen during the winter, and this was the same for all of the huts that all the expedition would build, the snow would build up, the drift would build up, and you end up with a thick layer all around. In some circumstances, they actually put a window with an opening big enough in the roof so a man would actually be able to climb out. They would dig down into the snow as well and use it as an area to store things, and in certain circumstances they would use it as an area for the kennels for the dogs rather than them having to sleep outside. In the 1950s, during the Trans-Commonwealth Antarctic Expedition led by Fuchs and Hillary, Sir Edmund Hillary, of course, Everest fame, he decided to have prefabricated modular buildings. So they were pre-built, and then as soon as they got there, they would be able to set up and use them almost instantly. There were areas where they had to connect them together, and you can still see them today. They are still owned and maintained by the New Zealand government. And they were a revolution in the way that they built things. On the other side of the continent, which was the area that Fuchs was in charge of, they were still doing things the old way. In fact, a small team went down nearly a year before to start building the base that his men would use before they made their attempt across the continent, which is what Sir Ernest Shackleton had been trying to do on his Endurance expedition in 1914. So Hillary's idea was good, but it was very, very expensive. To have separate parts and then put everything together was a much cheaper option. And that's what they'd have to do as well. So all of their things, such as the sledges, for example, like this one here, they would have to construct when they were down there and then add all the bits onto it that they would need for when they were sledging. So these leather straps, for example, that I'm just adding to this one here, these would be going around the sledging boxes that would carry all of the supplies, the food, the scientific equipment, etc., that they would need on their journey to the pole. There is a very nice snuggly sleeping bag. These, of course, were normally only issued to those that were going out across the continent itself. When in a Shackleton ship, the Endurance, got crushed into the ice, there was a mixture of sleeping bags and blankets. They drew lots for who would get what, and hopefully you would be able to stay relatively warm. So, once all this was done and your base camp was built, it would then be a case of making your first forays inland for either supplies, scientific research, or perhaps a journey to the pole. To travel across the snow, ice, and hopefully up the glaciers onto the Polar Plateau, you would need to be properly equipped, of course. So we would be wearing several layers. The one that you can see at the minute is the outer layer. This is a windproof smock and trousers made by the company called Burberry. Burberry used to make very high-end bespoke clothing for officers of the British Army, for example, and the gentry, and they were approached to do the clothing for various Antarctic expeditions, including Captain Scott's and, of course, later on as well, Sir Ernest Shackleton's. So, that's what I've got on over the top with a drawstring neck. There would be a separate hood that would go over this as well, that would tie round, and under that, a balaclava, which is currently being worn as sort of a little bobble hat. So I've got gloves as well, but on the outside, these would be finiskew, or reindeer skin gloves. So nice and furry, great big mitts, all the way up to keep you as insulated as possible. Footwear could be very much the same. So again, made out of finiskew. The boots that I've currently got on, that you can't see at the minute, are slightly later ones, which are over boots for working in the snow. These are actually Arctic rather than Antarctic ones, but they do exactly the same job. The reason why these gloves are on these long bits of string is that if you need to do something fiddlier with your fingers, you don't drop them in the snow and ice, and they don't get cold, and they don't freeze, and hopefully they don't give you frostbite either. Frostbite attacks the tips of the fingers, anything that sticks out like the tips of the nose or the bottom of the earlobes. You can recover from frostbite, but if it's really, really bad, what could happen? It's like getting a burn almost. Your fingers go exceptionally red, and it's basically killed off the blood vessels. In certain circumstances, if you've got frostbite, it's so bad that you would actually be able to snap your own fingers off. So not a very pleasant sensation to have to endure at all. And as we said earlier on, there is no hope of rescue in Antarctica. You've got to sort yourself out of whatever situation you might find yourself in. This behind me here is a picture of the Ross Ice Shelf. Now, one of the reasons why the British expeditions tried to get to the Ross Ice Shelf is that it was the closest part to then be able to strike out to the South Pole, so you didn't have quite so far to go. That being said, the South Pole is still roughly about 1,000 miles from there until you reach the very bottom of the Earth. When Ernest Shackleton went down and landed in the Weddell Sea, you had to move your way through the ice floes to try and get as close as you possibly could to the coastline. Again, he was trying to get through the Weddell Sea, so he had less of a journey going over the Antarctic continent. Travelling across though is very, very dangerous. What happens is that the ice, when it's pushed together and when it's forming, can form great hills, and so you're going up and down. The going is very, very difficult, but also as well where it meets, occasionally you will end up with a crevasse. Now these are more common in the glaciers, but across the whole of the ice shelves these are very, very dangerous and regularly occurring items. What would normally happen if you were dealing with a crevasse is you would send out a person out in front and they would probe with a long stick to find if there was any chance of the very thin layer of snow and ice above suddenly giving way and you going down. When you're marching along, normally you're pulling 4 men to a sledge. Your sledge weighs about 200 pounds in weight. So very, very heavy, and obviously would be very, very little chance of anything stopping you. Crevasses could be from a few feet to a few hundred feet deep. One of Captain Scott's party, as he was going along, found himself suddenly dangling down from the end of his sledging harness after he'd gone through a very, very thin ice bridge. Fortunately, because he was attached to the sledge still and that was on firm ground, he was able to be hauled back up and so didn't plunge to his death. Douglas Mawson, when he was left alone after his 2 companions died during his expedition on the Aurora in 1914, he fell down a crevasse and found it very, very difficult because he'd lost most of his food at that point in time because one of his companions had died by falling down a crevasse and taking the sledge with all the food on it as well. So he was very, very weak and he found it very, very difficult to climb out. But his sledge had ledged above, making a little bridge of his own, and eventually he hauled himself out on the rope. So this is very, very treacherous going, and when the Trans-Commonwealth Antarctic Expedition went down in the 1950s, they were going across this with heavy tracked vehicles known as snowcats. So of course it was even more important for them to get out and make sure that any crossing areas were as thick as possible so they didn't end up plunging to their deaths. There's a very, very famous photo though of one of the front sponsons of the snowcat dangling precariously over the edge of a very deep crevasse. Fortunately for the party, they made it safely to the South Pole and eventually all the way across to pick up Sir Edmund Hillary's team on the other side of the continent. This is the base of the Beardmore Glacier, and you can see it extending all the way up onto the Polar Plateau. In fact, this stretch of glacier extends for about 100 miles altogether. It's one of the closest areas that British teams could get up there as best they could. It was used later by Sir Ernest Shackleton on the Nimrod expedition. Ernest Shackleton himself got very, very close to the pole. He was within 100 miles when he decided to turn back. They were very, very low on food, and they realised that if they spent much longer out there, they would probably end up dead. In fact, when he said to his wife upon his return, he thought it was better to be a live donkey than a dead lion. Yes, he didn't get the glory of the South Pole, but at least he lived to get the glory of nearly getting there. Captain Scott himself, of course, went up here and on his second expedition, although made it to the South Pole and struggled massively on the way back, sadly didn't make it. But this was the main route that the explorers from the British teams at least tried to use to get up towards the South Pole. There's a huge mountain range, Queen Alexander Range, that this is on, and different explorers use different routes. For example, when Amundsen went up onto the Polar Plateau, when he gained the South Pole first, he actually moved up 2 glaciers before getting onto the Polar Plateau. So once you're up there, obviously you need slightly different equipment. When you're man-hauling and pulling it yourself, you're using skis, but crampons are really, really important. So a set of these, obviously with spikes that would be going into the ice, and these would strap onto the base of your boot and hopefully give you a bit of grip as you're trying to climb up. Ice axes were also used as well to help men haul themselves. There'd be a strap that would go around their wrist here, and you've got the spike in the bottom as well. This little bit here would be used to cut steps into the ice to help yourself climb up or climb down more safely. When Ernest Shackleton realised that his only hope of rescue after the Endurance expedition in 1914 was to rescue himself, when they went across the South Atlantic in a very, very small boat called the James Caird, they made it to South Georgia, but they'd made it to the wrong side of the island. It was the closest inhabited place for miles and miles. They landed on the wrong side and then had to climb over the top of the mountain. They had 50 foot of rope and, fortunately, an ice axe. They started to cut steps on the way down the other side to try and make it safe. It took them a very long time and they kept falling over until eventually they decided to sit together, the 3 of them, and hurtle down the other side
as if they were tobogganing. Very, very dangerous, of course, because they get no idea if there are any precipices, drops, crevasses, anything like that at all. No one had ever climbed over the island before. It was the first time they'd done it. And, of course, they did it because they were desperate. The other two members that went over were Thomas Crean and Frank Worsley. So, once you've climbed up here, hopefully the going will be slightly easier, slightly flatter, and with no crevasses once you're on top of the Polar Plateau. So, trying to erect a tent in a blizzard with the snow coming down and the wind howling around you could be a really, really difficult thing to do. But of course, it was a matter of life or death. You had to have shelter, otherwise you would definitely freeze outside. Douglas Mawson's book about his expedition was known as the home of the blizzard because it was so windy where they landed on their part of Antarctica that frequently gusts were registered at 70 and sometimes over 100 miles an hour. Once inside the tent, though, at least you got a little bit of shelter from the elements, and then, of course, you could start getting into a sleeping bag, possibly getting out of some wet clothes, but as well making some food. Now, we mentioned about food earlier on, that on the way down you would have pretty decent meals, but sledging rations were slightly different. Some things they took down with them had to last for a very, very long time. For example, one of the things was this. This is pea flour. It's soup in a minute. Add boiling water, and in theory, it will feed up to 4 people altogether. But bulky tins like this would be too heavy to take with them, and they'd need lots of different types of food in order to get everything they needed. The most common types of things that they would have would be small amounts of chocolate, biscuits as well, but also the main thing would be something called pemmican. This was made by the company Bovril, and it basically tastes like very, very salty beef gravy. Depending on how much you could heat it up, you could either have it as a jelly or as a drink. And to save on taking up too much space, you would just usually have it out of a simple tin mug with a spoon. Obviously with a spoon you can stir it and you can shovel it down your throat as well. So anything to try and save weight. And they'd be cooking it on little primus stoves like this, so fuel was very, very important and something they had to take with them. That would obviously go in, you would then pump up the pressure, and once it's lit, the pot would go on top. Now, there are different types of pot. This style here would then go inside another pot. That's partly to keep the heat in, help with snow melting, but then of course once that heats up, it acts as a radiator and the rest of the tent can get warm from that as well in a safe way. So very, very good. You're not wasting any fuel and you're keeping as warm as possible. But to have all of the supplies to be able to take you across the whole of Antarctica on a sledge would be an impossibility. So for the first year or the first season that they were down there, they would be laying supply depots up until almost the Beardmore Glacier. These were normally denoted by flags. Red was one of the best colours that you could see, obviously, against the snow and ice. Yellow, because of the sunlight, wasn't very, very good. Black, weirdly, wouldn't be very good because of the shadows sometimes that are cast, particularly in the ice fields where there's glaciers and things like that. It'd be very difficult to see. Blue, again, because of course ice is frozen water, so that would be tricky. Red would be very good, and they'd have various depots. The biggest depot that Captain Scott was hoping to reach was known as 1 Ton Depot on the Great Ice Barrier on his return journey. During the previous season, when he'd been laying supplies, they were struggling with the weather, the dogs were getting weaker, and so were the horses, that he decided to set up 1 Ton Depot further north than where it should have been. Captain Oates said to him, "You will regret this, sir," but Captain Scott decided to press on anyway. Upon Captain Scott's return journey, he was about 7 miles short of where he placed the depot. If he'd have placed it where he wanted to originally, he would have been safe with all the supplies there by about 4 miles. So if he'd have stuck to his plan in that respect, he probably would have been saved. 1 Ton Depot had loads and loads of supplies, fuel, extra food. Whilst Captain Scott might have failed in his mission to get to the South Pole, the scientific research and the scientific study on his expedition, on which was the Terra Nova, ship very, very similar to the Discovery, in 1912 when he died, was absolutely vast. It's one of the most complete and extensive scientific investigations ever undertaken on the Antarctic continent. So, hopefully this would be enough to sustain you until you eventually gained your goal of the South Pole. And there, hopefully success. You can see behind me the station now that's permanently manned by scientists at the South Pole. This is the Amundsen Scott Base, named, of course, after the 2 famous explorers who made it to the South Pole first. And unfortunately for Captain Scott, awaiting him when he got there was a small tent and a Norwegian flag left by Roald Amundsen with a letter, one addressed to Captain Scott personally and the other one asking Captain Scott, would you mind delivering this to the King of Norway for me? Which must have been a bit of a kick in the teeth when they'd struggled all the way through. And struggle is definitely the word. As you can see, I've been holding some skiing poles here. Man-hauling is a bit like cross-country skiing. You're sliding through on the very long wooden skis that will be attached to your boots, and you're pushing away with your skiing poles to try and repel you through the ice and snow. So very, very difficult. And of course, you could sink down quite a way into the ice as well. It's a bit like a creme brulee. So a slightly hard layer on the top where the frost has got to it, and then very, very soft underneath. But hopefully, when you got to the South Pole, you would be able to see the station, raise your flag in success that you have managed to make it all safely in one piece and claim the South Pole for the Empire as Captain Scott had hoped to do. But sadly, of course, he never made it back. So, even today, getting to the South Pole is a very, very dangerous operation. Several people attempt it every year and still several people die. Even though with modern technology, things have not got any safer down in the South Pole. There are British research bases. In fact, there are research bases all across Antarctica. The main area that Britain operates is off an area around Port Lockroy, which is the world's most southerly post office. So if you are down there and you need to post a letter or anything, that's definitely the place to go to. Most of the year it's surrounded by penguins, but you can go and visit Antarctica as well. Fortunately, there is one of the most successful international treaties that governs what you can and can't do on the Antarctic Peninsula. It is there for research and science only. There cannot be weapons, you cannot do any military testing there or station any military troops there. And although several countries have claims to vast swathes of Antarctica, including Great Britain, everyone has said that they will not stake full claim to that area so that science and research can flourish. And every year it's very, very important, the data that they gather down in Antarctica, as it helps us to understand more about not only the ozone layer, which there's a hole above it which is slowly repairing itself, but also the rate of global warming. There are several glaciers across the whole of Antarctica that they're looking, known sometimes as the Doomsday Glacier, as once those go, they know it's on a long, slippery slope to the rising of sea levels and ever warmer temperatures as well. So, making it to the South Pole is a fantastic achievement, but don't forget, it's only half the journey, because you would have to make it all the way back again and then across the oceans and the seas to eventually get to tell your story, hopefully to a captive audience back home from whichever land you come from.